Oh, hello. This is Dr. Pete Mandick from William Patterson University. Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. In this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, especially his ethical theory, which we'll refer to as Kantianism. So, let's jump right into it. There's Kant. There's a painting and a cartoon drawing of Kant. What we're going to be focusing on in this video is his ethical theory. There's a lot more to Kant besides his ethical theory. He's very influential for what he has to say about epistemology and metaphysics as well, but we're just focusing here on the ethics. We're going to start by distinguishing utilitarianism from Kantianism in a lot of ways. One of the best ways to understand what Kantianism is all about is to think about the ways in which it is rebelling against utilitarianism. Secondly, we're going to talk about a distinction between hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. There's two kinds of imperatives, and they're very important to think about when we think about Kant's ethical theory, which is all about this thing that he calls the categorical imperative. In the third part of the video, we're going to be focusing on the categorical imperative. And Kant offers two different versions of this so-called categorical imperative, or two different interpretations of what the categorical imperative is supposed to be. And then finally, we're going to consider some objections to Kant's ethical theory. So let's start by contrasting utilitarianism and Kantianism. In Lecture 5, which was about utilitarianism, one of the things that we talked about was the way in which utilitarianism and Kantianism differed over the idea of whether motives or intentions are important in determining moral praiseworthiness or moral blameworthiness, whether it matters for ethics or morality, what someone's state of mind is when they perform an action. If you do an action but you have like a weird intention or bad intention, does that change the moral status of the action? One of the examples I talked about in Lecture 5 was the example of two firemen who both rescue babies from burning buildings. But one of the firemen does it just because he wants to be famous, and the other one does it out of a genuine concern for human life. Now, a pure consequentialist, a philosopher that says only consequences matter, would say that the consequence was the same in the two cases of the two firemen. A life was saved, and so who cares what the motive was of the respective firemen? But you might have the hunch that it does matter, that there's something more praiseworthy about the person who is motivated by an interest in saving human lives, that treats lives as valuable in and of themselves, and well, then maybe Kantianism will appeal more to you than utilitarianism does. But recall we said in Lecture 5 that according to the utilitarian, intentions or motives don't matter for ethics, but we're going to see that in Kantianism they do matter. One way of stating a really important difference between utilitarianism and Kantianism is a difference over this idea of whether the ends justify the means. So the utilitarian will assert that the ends justify the means. And a really important idea in Kantianism is this denial of this claim. The ends do not justify the means, according to the Kantian. So it's important to keep in mind what ends and means are. Ends are like goals or things that are valued, things that you're trying to bring about. And the means are the ways in which you get those things, the methods or the processes or the actions that lead to those things. And Kant makes a big deal about the idea of treating people as means to ends. And he thinks that that's a bad thing. In the language of means and ends, if you're going to bring people into it, then people should be regarded as ends, not as means. one way we might put it is to say that on the Kantian framework, people need to be regarded as ends unto themselves, and they should never be treated as means, or maybe they should never be treated merely as means. Another way to draw a contrast between utilitarianism and Kantianism has to do with the question of what thing or things are good. According to utilitarians, pleasure is the highest good. Maybe there are other things that are good too, but they are all good only insofar as they lead to pleasure. Pleasure is good in and of itself, and so it's therefore the highest good. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Someone is trying to call me on the phone, and I have declined the phone call. Maybe I'll edit this out later. Or maybe not. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Okay, so we were talking about the idea of what is good. Utilitarians hold that pleasure is the highest good. And Kant responds to that and says that the only thing that is good in and of itself is a good will. That it doesn't really make sense to talk about pleasure as being good. One way to get a sense of this is to think about, for example, the ways in which there can be something good happening even if you're not feeling any pleasure. So think about certain kinds of medicine or medical procedures you undergo to achieve some kind of greater good. So the idea there is that just because something is going to be unpleasant, something that brings about a low amount of pleasure or a high amount of pain, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. There are lots of situations where perhaps it's good to feel pain. Maybe a really good workout is one in which you feel a lot of pain while it's happening. So the idea here is that pleasure isn't good in and of itself. It's only good relative to the way it relates to something else. But what could that something else be? And according to Kant, the only thing that could be like intrinsically valuable is the human will. And you should be thinking of things like free will and the ability of people to make choices, the ability to be free or autonomous. That is something that is intrinsically good. And this is closely related to the idea of treating people as ends unto themselves, as opposed to means to ends. When you treat someone as a means to an end, you're using that person. And when you're using that person, you're not really respecting their autonomy. You're not really respecting their freedom to decide for themselves. If respecting someone to decide for themselves is something that you ought to do, then it's a good thing to have that kind of freedom. My phone is making weird noises. Well, I guess I'm going to have to edit this part out. At the heart of Kant's ethical theory is this thing called the categorical imperative. And it's a little funny that it gets called the categorical imperative, because when you use the word the like that, it makes it sound like there's only one thing, one categorical imperative. And arguably there's actually two categorical imperatives, and it's hard to see how these two different categorical imperatives are really just the same thing. According to Kant, they're just two different ways of wording the same basic idea. And whatever, we'll grant that to Kant. But nonetheless, we'll talk about these two different versions of the categorical imperative, or two different interpretations of the categorical imperative. But before we get to Kant's categorical imperative, we need to talk in general about what imperatives are. What does it mean for something to be an imperative? And what are the two main kinds of imperative? What's the difference between a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative? Well, let's first start with the basic idea of an imperative. And we can put this in terms of statements or sentences. In language, there's two different kinds of sentences: declarative sentences and imperative sentences. Actually, there's three kinds of sentences. There's also interrogatives. Interrogatives are questions, declaratives are statements, and imperatives are commands. So a statement, a declarative sentence, is something that can be either true or false. It's a description of what is the case. Imperatives, like if I were to order someone to go shut the window, that's not the sort of thing that could be true or false. It could be obeyed or disobeyed. Or you could ask a question like, is the wash machine filled up? That's a question. It's neither true nor false, but it could be answered or unanswered. So anyway, there are these three kinds of sentences. And one of these kinds of sentences, imperatives, are commands. Or we might put it as they have to do with what you should do or what you ought to do. The difference between hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives is that hypothetical imperatives put a condition on the thing that you should do. So one way we can put it is that hypothetical imperatives involve if-then statements. Instead of telling you categorically you ought to do this, they just tell you, well, if you're trying to achieve certain consequences, then it would make sense for you to do this. Let's look at some examples of hypothetical imperatives. So over here we've got a whole bunch of different examples, and note that they all have an if-then structure to them. They all use words like should, words that we can recognize as having to do with norms. So here, if you want to pass the test, then you should study. This isn't saying that everyone should study. It's just saying people that want to pass the test should study. So if you want to pass the test, then you should study. Is it saying that it's good to pass the test? No, I mean, like, who cares? If you wanted to pass the test, okay, well, here's some advice for you. You should study. If you're going to drink, then don't drive. If you can't make our meeting, be sure to call. If you're planning to read Kant, then drink lots of coffee. If you're the last one out, then turn out the lights. These are all hypothetical imperatives. They are expressing conditions. Hypothetically, if you wanted to achieve these conditions, then you ought to do the things in question. Excuse me. One interesting thing about hypothetical imperatives is that there's a sense in which these aren't really ethical. It is a pretty straightforward matter of empirical or a posteriori knowledge whether these if-then statements are true. So if you wanted to pass the test, then you ought to study. That's pretty much saying that it will help you pass the test to study. And that is something we could do an experiment to test. We could have a whole bunch of people study and a whole bunch of people not study and see which ones pass the test. If you're going to drink, then don't drive. Well, implied there is that there's going to be certain consequences to driving. Like maybe you'll crash your car, and we are assuming you don't want your car to be crashed, so therefore you shouldn't drink. Again, this is something that we can establish scientifically. But now let's contrast hypothetical imperatives with categorical imperatives. Categorical imperatives don't express any condition. They don't tell you why you should do this thing. They just tell you that you should do it. Take, for example, commandments like the 10 Commandments from the Old Testament of the Bible. In the 10 Commandments, there are things like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. It's not telling you if if you want to stay out of jail, you should do these things. It's just telling you you should do these things, full stop. Now you might say, well, isn't it implied that if you want to go to heaven or stay out of hell, then you should do these things, but otherwise, like, go ahead and do them? Well, if so, then they are actually hypothetical imperatives. But grammatically, as they're stated, they just say you should not do this. And you might argue, at least from the point of view of divine command theory, God's point of view of these is that they're just true. God doesn't believe that, well, like, yeah, I mean, if you wanted to go to heaven, okay. Like, he's saying, no, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. It's wrong to murder. The end. So what Kant is after is a categorical imperative, something that would have like the general structure of the sort of thing that you see in the 10 Commandments or that you see in divine command theory, but without bringing God into it. So in divine command theory, these commandments are supposed to be true because God said so. But what if you didn't believe that God existed, or instead you were convinced by the Euthyphro dilemma? You wanted to have an ethics that wasn't based on God, because basing it on God results in all sorts of problems besides the problem that maybe God doesn't exist. Well, one thing that Kant is trying to do is to see if he could use pure reason, like just by reasoning alone, can he establish the truth of a categorical imperative. So what if there was some kind of moral law, something that would apply to your behavior, no matter who you are, what your plans are, what your goals are, no matter what you're trying to achieve, regardless of whether you want to pass the test or you don't want to pass the test, regardless of whether you want to avoid going to jail or you don't care whether you go to jail. Is there something that would be true of all people in all situations, that you ought to act in such and such a way? And further, could it be something that's based on reason instead of being based on what God says? Well, here comes the categorical imperative. This is Kant's categorical imperative. This is Kant's attempt to ground a kind of pure morality on reason itself. So we're going to spend some time talking about the wording of this, and it's a little bit weird, but once you get the hang of it, you can see the point. And one thing to focus on is this idea that Kant offers two versions of the categorical imperative, or two interpretations of the categorical imperative. So here we go. This is the first interpretation of the categorical imperative, or the first version of the categorical imperative. And it goes like this: act only in those ways that you can rationally will your action to be a law of nature. So notice a couple things here. It's telling you how to act. So that makes it normative or moral or ethical. It's telling you how to act. It's telling you what actions you ought to do. It's not hypothetical. It's not saying, well, if you want to achieve such and such goal, then you should do these things. It's not setting any conditions. It's just telling you that this is how you ought to act. So that's the first thing to notice about the categorical imperative. Another thing to notice about the categorical imperative is that it is talking about what is rational. So this is an attempt to bring reason into it. We're trying to figure out how ethics can be based on reasoning. And then there's this weird phrase, rationally will something. We're going to talk a little bit about what it means to rationally will something. Then there's this other thing about willing your action to be a law of nature. What does that mean? So there's a couple things to think about here. And there's two things really that we need to focus on to really make sure we understand what's being said in the categorical imperative. And those two things are the idea of rationally willing something, and the second idea of that thing being a law of nature. So here's one way to put both of these things. So what it means to rationally will something, we might say, is to imagine it without there being any contradictions. So I can give you various descriptions, and then you can think about them and see if there's any contradictions in them. So what if I described a table? I just made a table, and it's in my workshop, and I tell you this table is a triangle. The shape of the table is a triangle, and it has four sides. You might think about it and think like, wait a minute, you mean the top of the table is a triangle? Yeah, the top of the table, it's a triangular tabletop. And, well, how many sides does the top of the table have? 4. Now, wait a minute, that's a contradiction, because triangles have 3 sides, and you're telling me this thing is triangular, but you're also telling me it has 4 sides. Well, that seems to be a contradiction, so I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that without imagining some kind of contradiction. And if I said, well, I want you to go and decide you're going to make such a table. Well, you couldn't rationally decide to make such a table. You couldn't rationally will yourself to make such a table. That would just lead to a contradiction. So that's the basic idea of rationally willing something. Can you imagine doing it without thereby bringing about some kind of contradiction? Now, what it means for there to be a law of nature is something like the idea of something that always happens. So we understand that it's a law of nature that what goes up must come down. If you let go of an object, it'll fall. That's a law of nature. And it always does that. Things always go up and then fall down. It's something that doesn't have any exceptions to it. So imagining an action to be a law of nature is to imagine that everyone does it, or everyone does it all the time. And this should remind you of, like, a very common thing that mothers and fathers tell their children, especially when the children are being naughty. What if everybody did that? What if everyone did that? And that's kind of the idea here of a law, like a law of nature. We're imagining an action is an action that everyone did. And would that lead to some kind of contradiction? If so, then you shouldn't do it. Let's take some examples of actions and try to apply the categorical imperative to them by asking, what if everybody did that? Would some kind of contradiction come about? If so, then you shouldn't do that thing. So let's start with theft. Let's talk about stealing things. What it means to steal things. Well, stealing isn't simply taking. There's all sorts of things you could take, and it doesn't count as stealing. So I could take a breath. I could take a look at the moon. Those are takings. I could take a picture. It's not necessarily stealing. I could take a drink of water from not only my personal private stash, but also I could go to a public place and take a drink of water from a water fountain. That's not stealing. What is stealing? Stealing is when you take something that belongs to somebody else, and further, you don't have their permission to do so. In other words, stealing is when you take someone's private property, and further, you take their private property without their permission. If you had their permission, it wouldn't be stealing. So, for example, if I called you up and said I wanted to borrow your bike, and you said, yeah, it's parked in front of my house, just go, come on by and take it whenever you want. Well, now I have your permission to take your bike. Or if I bought the bike from you, if I said, here's some money, can I have this bike? You're like, go ahead now, take it. I have permission to take that. So again, stealing has to do with taking private property without permission to do so. Now, that means that it's a logical necessity that if there's going to be any stealing, then there has to be private property. What if there wasn't any private property? What if all property was just public property, the way that the moon, the air, that's public property. That doesn't belong to anybody. The water in a water fountain, that's for the public. Anybody can take some. That's not private. What if all property was public property? Well, then you couldn't steal it. There wouldn't be any stealing. Now imagine this. Imagine that everyone just takes whatever they want whenever they want it, and they don't even bother asking for permission. They just take whatever they want whenever they want it without seeking permission to do so. Well, if everyone did that all the time, then there wouldn't be any private property. The whole idea of private property wouldn't make any sense. Like, I'd be playing my guitar, and then someone would come into my house and they'd just take my guitar and leave, and I'd be like, oh, I guess I don't have a guitar anymore. I'm just going to go walk across the street and take a bicycle and go on down to the local ice cream store and take some ice cream. And I get down there and there's no store there because someone came by and they took the whole store. It would be a weird, crazy situation in which, well, there just wouldn't be any private property. Everything would be basically public property. Everyone taking whatever they wanted whenever they wanted it. But wait a minute, if under that circumstance everything is public property, then no one was actually stealing anyway. But now this story is actually logically contradictory. We start off by imagining everybody stealing, and we wound up with it being the case that nobody is stealing. But that's a contradiction. It's a contradiction if everybody is stealing and nobody is stealing. The contradiction arises because we imagine, what if everybody did that? What if everybody stole all the time? But if everybody did that, then logically nothing would count as private property, and so therefore it wouldn't be stealing. That's a contradiction. And then, therefore, that's an example of something you shouldn't do. So let's go through the categorical imperative explicitly. So here's this statement. Act only in those ways that you can rationally will your action to be a law of nature. Okay, so I'm thinking about stealing something. That's an action I'm contemplating doing. But then I ask Kant, can I perform that action? And Kant tells me, well, You should only perform it if you can rationally will it to be a law of nature. If you can imagine everybody doing it all the time without some kind of contradiction arising. Okay, so I try to imagine that, and I realize that if everyone stole, then no one would steal because there just wouldn't be any private property to steal. That's what would happen, so therefore I shouldn't do it. It would lead to a contradiction if everybody acted that way. I cannot rationally will that action to be a law of nature. But what about an opposite thing? Like, how about taking a drink of water whenever you're thirsty? I'm thinking about doing that. I'm thirsty. I'm going to take a drink of water. Well, what if everybody did that? What if everybody took a little bit of water and drank it whenever they were thirsty? Would that lead to some kind of like logical contradictory chaos? No, I mean, that's kind of what happens now already, and we're doing all right. Let's look at some of our other examples. So that was stealing. How about lying? Why is lying wrong according to the categorical imperative? Well, let's think about it. If I am going to lie to you, it's not enough simply that I tell a falsehood. Telling a falsehood is not the same as lying. There's lots of ways. Like if I said to you right now, there is not a guitar behind me, that's not a lie. Like, you can see that there's a guitar, and I know you can see it. It would be like a joke or something like that. Or if I told a story, if I said something like, one day there was a unicorn, and the unicorn played guitar, and you're like, oh, that's a pretty good story. Not really. But anyways, you appreciate that it's a story, and it's not true, but it's not a lie either. Like, you don't go to the movies and then like leave angry, like, they were lying to me. Like, you appreciate that it's fun to contemplate falsehoods sometimes. And so fiction is not the same as lying. What is lying? Lying is when I purposefully try to get you to believe something that I think is false. That's what lying is. It kind of doesn't matter whether the thing is true or false. What matters is that I think it's false, and further, I'm trying to get you to believe it's true, even though I think it's false. That would be lying. And so we might distinguish between what they call white lies, like if I tell you something, I'm trying to fool you about something, but it's in order to make you feel good. That's like, maybe that's not so bad, but that's still lying. A lie is when I try to get you to believe something that I think is false, and further, I'm doing it on purpose. I'm doing it deliberately. If I just accidentally tell a falsehood, that's not really lying either. So lying involves the purposeful attempt to deceive somebody. So now, in order for there to be lying, there has to be some kind of possibility of you being deceived. If it was impossible for you to be deceived, then I really couldn't tell a lie. That's like, I really can't lie to you about whether there's a guitar behind me, because you could see the guitar. Now, also, part of the way that I'm able to lie to you is that, well, you don't know whether I'm telling the truth or not. It's because you're not maybe 100% sure whether I'm telling the truth or not. That's what makes it possible for me to have a chance at deceiving you. But now imagine a situation in which someone lied all the time, and further, that everybody lied all the time. Not just sometimes, but all the time. Well, if people were always lying when they were speaking, they were lying, then it would follow then that they're guaranteed to be telling the opposite of the truth when they're speaking. But if they're guaranteed to tell the opposite of the truth while they're speaking, then you can figure out what the truth is. So imagine this. Imagine I tell you, in this imaginary scenario where I'm always saying false things, suppose I told you, I do not have a silver car. Well, you now know that I do have a silver car, okay? If it's guaranteed that whatever I say is false, then all you have to do is reverse it in your mind, and you now know what the truth is. But if you know that, then I know that too. I know that you can just reverse it in your mind, and you'll know what the truth is. So in a system where people are guaranteed to always be lying, that's a system in which people can be guaranteed to be able to figure out what the truth is. And therefore, they wouldn't be able to be deceived. And so therefore, I wouldn't be able to deliberately deceive them, and so therefore it wouldn't be lying. So if I am about to tell a lie, I have to ask myself, what if everybody did that? And the answer is, if everybody did that, there wouldn't be any lying. If everybody lied, no one would lie, but that's a contradiction, so therefore it's wrong. You cannot rationally will it to be a law of nature. And one last example, murder. What if everybody went around killing everybody all the time? What would happen next? Well, what happened next is that no one would be killing anybody because they'd all be dead. So that's kind of contradictory. Also, it doesn't seem like a very good lifestyle choice to murder, especially if you're going to imagine everybody murdering everybody else. Now, there are some problems with this categorical imperative. One sort of problem has to do with the ways in which one and the same action could be described in different ways. You could describe that action with more generality, or you could describe it with less generality. And how you describe it ends up making it look like maybe it wasn't so bad or not. So take the action of shooting someone to death with a gun. Now, that sounds pretty bad, but what if we re-described it in a more general way? What's a more general way of describing it? Well, I just made a piece of metal move across, right? Like the bullet is a piece of metal. Oh, what did I do is I made a piece of metal move. Well, is that wrong? What if people made pieces of metal move all the time? Well, that doesn't seem like it's going to lead into a contradiction. So there's an action, shooting someone to death with a gun. And you can describe that action in a more general way, and that'll make it seem not so bad, according to the categorical imperative. I could also take that same action and describe it in a less general way, a more specific way. So instead of saying this more general thing, which is just moving a piece of metal, I could say this highly specific thing, which is shooting someone to death on a Tuesday while they were facing north. Well, what if everyone did that? What if everyone shot someone to death on a Tuesday while that person was facing north? Well, I mean, that wouldn't be great, but it wouldn't lead to a total outright end of the world the way that everyone killing everyone all the time would. So, again, an action only gets tripped up by the categorical imperative depending on how general you describe that action and which description is the right way to describe it. You need to know that ahead of time, don't you? And how can you know that ahead of time? The categorical imperative doesn't seem like it's helping. But what we want to know is what right and wrong is. So this objection leads us to think that maybe the categorical imperative is a terrible guide to trying to figure out what right and wrong is. Well, lucky for Kant, he has a different interpretation of the categorical imperative. This is interpretation 2 or version 2. So instead of all this stuff about like, can you rationally will your action to be a law of nature, it's worded like this. Only treat people as ends unto themselves and never as a means to an end. So never use people to accomplish things. Don't use a person to accomplish some goal. You have to treat people as goals unto themselves. So one way of putting this is to say that the right way to act, like this is the one rule for all action, is an act in which you're respecting people for their own goals, their own values, their own interests. You are respecting the inherent dignity of other people. Now that raises certain questions. Like, aren't there lots of cases in which there's some sense in which we're using people, and further, it's actually not that bad to do that? So think of the case of someone that's doing their job. You don't know this person. They're kind of a stranger to you, but you go to the store, and there they are. They are working at the cash register. They're maybe also bagging groceries, and that's something that that benefits you. And so you take advantage of this situation. In some sense, you take advantage of this person. You let them bag your groceries. You let them ring up your groceries, and aren't you using that person? I mean, maybe you talk to them while this is happening. Maybe you try to make friends with them. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're just like, hey, all right, give me my groceries. Is it wrong to interact with people the way we interact in a generally capitalistic system where they are doing jobs and we are benefiting from the jobs that they're doing, and these people don't really mean much to us beyond that? Is that using people? Now, one way out is to draw a distinction between merely using someone and using someone, or merely treating them as a means to an end, versus treating them as a means to an end and also appreciating that they have their own dignity. So, in the case of the cashier, well, yes, you are using this person in a sense. You're using them to help you get your groceries, but you're not treating them merely as a means to an end. You also care about them. At least I hope so. Like you wouldn't kill them or you wouldn't lie to them or anything like that. So you're not treating them merely as a means to an end. Let's talk a little bit about some of the sorts of examples we talked about in connection with other ethical theories and ask ourselves, well, what would the Kantian do? So take, for example, the the sorts of like sacrifices that utilitarians like to talk about. Is it okay to sacrifice this person to save these people? Well, arguably, a Kantian would say no, it's not justified. If you sacrifice this person, you're using them as a means to an end. And that is bad. Now, you might say, well, could I get out of it with this merely thing? I'm not using them merely as a means to an end. Well, then that's not clear that that's going to get you out of it. But there's a basic idea that comes out in other examples from Kant that really makes it look like he would say that it's not justified to pull this lever. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, if I don't pull the lever, these people are going to be dead, and isn't that as good as killing them myself? Well, intentions do matter for the Kantian, and so you aren't the one that is causing them to die. They were going to die anyway. You didn't make them die. So it's not like you killed them anyway. If you assume consequentialism, where only consequences matter, well, they're going to be dead regardless of whether you kill them or the trolley kills them. So there is no difference there. But to say to the Kantian, isn't it the same as killing them, is to beg the question against the Kantian, is to give a circular argument against Kantianism. You're assuming consequentialism to make your point. But what's supposed to be up for grabs is whether consequentialism is true. So let's look at this other example from Kant. Kant tells this story to illustrate how much he really means it when he says that you can't deviate from the categorical imperative and you can't be using people even to bring about so-called good consequences. And the story goes something like this. So imagine one night you're trying to get to sleep and you hear a knock on the door and you get up and you go and you answer the door, and it's a very close friend of yours, and the close friend says, help me, there's like some psycho, crazy, like totally corrupt cops that they're trying to frame me for some crime, and I think they're going to try to maybe even kill me. Can I please hide out in your home? And you say, well, yes, you are my good friend, and I wouldn't want you to die, so yes, you can hide out in my home. Please come and try to get some rest. So your friend comes in and goes to sleep, and a couple hours later you hear another knock on the door, and here it is, the crazy guys. And they ask you, is your friend hiding here? Now you have a choice to make. You could choose to tell the truth to these evil, bad people, and then they will go and find your friend and kill your friend. Or you could tell a lie. You could say, no, my friend's not here. I just got a phone call saying my friend's in Florida, or something like that. So what do? Do you tell the truth or do you tell the lie? Well, Kant says you should tell the truth. Now, a lot of people think this sounds crazy, but what Kant says is that, look, you have an obligation to always tell the truth. Now, these cops have an obligation to not kill people, and unfortunately they are going to break their obligations, and they're going to go kill your friend. But you're not the one who killed your friend. It's the cops that killed the friend. Your moral duty is to tell the truth. Their moral duty is to not kill people. It's not your fault if they happen to kill your friend. But it would be bad if you told a lie to the cops. That's what Kant is saying. And so based on that, which sounds pretty horrible, and we'll talk about a version of the horribleness objection that applies to Kant, based on what Kant says about the lying to the cops, you might say, like, oh, I can see why the Kantian maybe wouldn't pull the lever. You have a moral obligation to not kill people. If you pull the lever, you kill this guy. You are acting in a way that causes this guy to die. If you don't pull the lever, well, these people will die, but you didn't kill them. The trolley was going to kill them anyway. You aren't the one making them die if you do nothing. But if you do something, you are making this one die. So that's how the Kantianism is supposed to make sense with respect to the trolley problem. We get a similar answer to the version of the trolley with the fat man. Again, you're not justified in killing one person, just even if there are these great consequences of saving the lives of 5. But now you might say, like, well, Kantianism has certain horrible consequences. Another way to put it is that what's going on, at least in some of these cases, is that there are competing rights claims. So everybody has a right to be told the truth, even those evil cops. They have a right to be told the truth. And everyone has a right to life, like your friend that's hiding in your attic. And here's an example in which there are people with competing rights claims. The cops have a right. Your friend has a right. Now, how do you decide which right to respect? This criticism says that the categorical imperative doesn't give you any basis, any way to decide between competing rights claims. Where maybe utilitarianism does a better job on this. So the utilitarian could say, like, well, all right, if you tell the cops a lie, well, that's going to make the cops sad. That's going to cause some unhappiness. But if you tell them the lie, it's going to cause your friend way more happiness. Your friend's going to get to stay alive, and that's like really a big deal. And so therefore, we have a way of resolving competing rights claims with utilitarianism. What you do is you try to figure out which actions will lead to the most amount of pleasure, or which actions will maximize the ratio of pleasure over pain, something like that. So you have a way of deciding between competing rights claims there. So we have talked about the categorical imperative. We talked about what the categorical imperative is in contrast to various other kinds of imperatives, like hypothetical imperatives. We emphasized the distinction between utilitarianism and Kantianism, and we talked about these two different interpretations of the categorical imperative. The first one was the one about rationally willing something to be a law of nature, and the second one says you should always treat people as ends unto themselves, never as means to ends. We talked about some objections. One of them was, you might call it a kind of horrible objection, that is, that Kantianism has certain just obviously horrible entailments. Like, it's just obviously wrong that you should tell the truth to those corrupt police officers. But also, there's perhaps separate worry that Kantianism doesn't give you any basis for distinguishing between competing rights claims in the way that perhaps utilitarianism would. What I would like to do now is to watch this short little video clip, which is kind of fun. It's like a cartoon that's a little bit silly, but also offers a good review of Kant's ethics. So we're going to watch it. Actually, you are going to watch it, and while you're watching it, I'm going to read this book, which happens to be written by Kant. Okay, so when I'm done reading the book, you'll probably be done watching the video, and I'll see you then. All right.
Immanuel Kant was a 19th century German philosopher most notable for... Yes, that's right, Kant. That's how you pronounce it. Not Kant, not Kant, not Jones, but Kant. It's a German name, and I'm quite happy to sit here in silence until you're mature enough to get over it. Okay, good. So Immanuel Kant was an 18th century German philosopher most notable for his work on ethics. Ethics is the philosophical study of moral action. It's not just about judging people per se, but rather looking at right and wrong as concepts in themselves and how we might figure out the best way for people to behave. There are two general schools of thought on this. Consequentialism divides right from wrong entirely based on the consequences of an action, or in other words, the end justifies the means. Deontology, on the other hand, is the position that the consequences don't really matter because moral judgment is contained in the act alone. Kant was a deontologist, and frustrated with the sort of Mickey Mouse wishy-washy subjectivity of moral theory of the day, he proposed an absolute, stone-cold, objective, unbreakable moral law which he called the Categorical Imperative. The Categorical Imperative is based upon Kant's idea that morality is derived from rationality and all moral judgments are rationally supported. So just as rational thought leads us to an objective reality, so too is there an objective morality we can locate through the same process. The Categorical Imperative is an absolute non-negotiable universal moral law that holds up regardless of context and circumstance. Kant was absolutely unwavering on this point. What's right is right and what's wrong is wrong, full stop. To further analyse Kant's ethical framework, we can break the Categorical Imperative down into three maxims. The first maxim is that all your actions must have universality. In other words, you should only do something if you think it would be okay if everybody did it all the time. For example, you might be innocently flirting with your 18-year-old co-worker behind your wife's back, but to work out whether this is okay, you have to first imagine a world in which literally every single human being around the entire globe was flirting constantly with attractive teenagers as soon as his or her partner's back was turned. If this doesn't seem like a desirable world to live in, then it's not okay to do it, not even once. The second maxim is that every human being must be treated as an end rather than a means to an end. What this basically means is that you're never allowed to manipulate anyone no matter what. This stands in stark opposition to consequentialist theories that take into account the greater good. Kant thought that the greater good was irrelevant. Each person is his own rational agent and no one person may be manipulated to achieve the goals of another. That means that you can never lie. Ever, to anybody, under any circumstances, for any reason. The third maxim is that you should always behave as though you are the absolute moral authority of the entire universe. It should be noted that some people already think this, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Kant. A major criticism of Kant's second maxim is that if somebody came to your door with an axe and asked you to kindly tell him the location of your children so that he can hack them into tiny pieces, you would be morally obligated to tell him the truth. Kant responded quite controversially, yes. You would, but he didn't see anything wrong with that. Because the murderer is his own moral agent, you're not responsible for his choices, you're only responsible for your own. That said, there's also nothing morally wrong with you locking the door and calling the police. Immanuel Kant is one of the most influential philosophers of all time, not only in ethics, but in epistemology and political theory. However, I only have 3 minutes to talk about him, and quite frankly, anyone who logs onto the internet to listen to me talk about Kant for 3 minutes has already realised this is nothing like what they'd expected.
Wow, that was a good read. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the video. So we just have a little bit left to do in this video, and that is to talk about some study questions. So, study question number 1. An example of a hypothetical imperative is A, if you are planning to pass the test, then you should study. B, if you're going to drink, then don't drive. C, if you can't make our meeting, be sure to call. D, if you're planning to read Kant, then drink lots of coffee. E, all of the above. Study question 2. One formulation of Kant's categorical imperative is A, treat others as means to your own ends and not as ends in themselves. B, do not treat others merely as ends in themselves but as means to your own ends. C, treat others as ends in themselves and never merely as means to your own ends. D, treat ends as themselves and never merely as means to others. E, mean what you say and say what you mean. With a lot of these multiple choice questions, it might make your brain feel a little fuzzy because the different options use a lot of the same words. So read them carefully and really try to tell what the difference is in the different options and think about which option is the best one. Study question 3. One objection to Kantian ethics is A, it advises treating others as ends in themselves. B, cultural relativists reject an absolute moral law. C, there are hypothetical imperatives. D, lying is always immoral according to Kant, even when there are horrible consequences to telling the truth. E, it is impractical. So those are the 3 study questions, and here are the answers. The answer to question 1 is E. The answer to question 2 is C. And The answer to question 3 is D. And that brings us to the end of the lecture. So that's the end of lecture 6. Until next time, I'm Dr. Pete Mandick, and keep it philosophical. Bye-bye.